The one who betrayed you looked like they walked away untouched. They didn't. While you were still trying to understand what happened, they seemed to keep moving without carrying the same weight. You were left with questions that followed you into the night and refused to settle easily. Meanwhile, they could still laugh, make plans, and appear as though the story had already ended. That may have been one of the hardest parts of the betrayal. It was not only what they did, it was how little it seemed to cost them afterward. From where you were standing, they seemed free while you were still living with the aftermath. That can make a wounded person ask questions they never expected to ask. How can someone cause this much pain and seem to feel none of it? How can they sleep while you were still trying to understand what was real? How can they keep moving when you are still carrying what their choices left behind? But what looked like silence to you was never blindness to God. He saw the betrayal before you knew how to name everything it changed. He saw the contradictions, the broken trust, and the private moments when you questioned your own memory. He also saw something you could not see from the outside. Looking peaceful is not the same as having peace. Moving forward is not the same as being free from what your choices have created. A person can look untouched while carrying patterns and consequences that have not become visible yet. That is why appearance was never the final answer. Their calm may have looked like proof that they got away with it. It was not. Your pain was never evidence that they were stronger, wiser, or somehow right about what happened. It meant something real had wounded you, and God did not need their confession before He understood the weight you were carrying. But there is another side to this story. Some pain can be dismissed only while a person is standing outside of it. From a distance, sleeplessness can look dramatic, confusion can look weak, and caution can look unnecessary. That changes when life brings similar emotional pressure close enough to be felt. Then old judgments begin sounding different. The person who once dismissed your questions may begin carrying questions of their own. The person who thought tension was weakness may discover how difficult peace becomes when trust feels uncertain. And what once looked easy to shake off can become much harder to dismiss from inside the experience. That is where this story begins to turn. Not through a dramatic public collapse that gives you a front row seat to their downfall. It often begins quietly, where appearances matter less, and a person has to live with what they actually feel. That is why you do not need to chase proof. You do not need to watch their social media or wait for someone to report that they are struggling. God saw what happened before any consequence became visible. And if truth is beginning to reach them now, it does not need your supervision to do its work. The first shift is much simpler than that. The person who looked untouched may not be as untouched as they appeared. The peace they seem to carry may not be as secure as it looked, and the pain they once watched from a distance may be moving much closer than they expected. Part 1. They're suffering now, and it's becoming personal. They are suffering now in ways most people around them may never see. Not necessarily through some dramatic collapse, but in the quiet hours, when there is no audience, and no easy way to distract themselves from what they are feeling. A conversation ends, but their mind keeps carrying it into the night, because something still does not feel settled. One answer creates another question. A detail does not quite match. And before long, they are replaying the whole thing again, trying to figure out what is true. They may still look fine during the day. They may still laugh, answer messages, go to work, and present the version of themselves they want other people to see. But looking fine and feeling peaceful are not the same thing. The person who once looked as though betraying you cost them nothing may now be discovering how exhausting it is when your mind will not let something go, simply because the day is over. That is where the suffering becomes personal. For a long time, they could look at your sleepless nights from the outside and decide you were overthinking. They could watch you replay conversations and tell themselves you were creating problems that were not really there. They could see you becoming cautious and call it insecurity. Because that explanation was easier than asking what had made you stop feeling safe. Now they may be living close enough to the same kind of uncertainty to understand why the mind reacts that way. A promise sounds reassuring in the moment, but later, the behavior does not match it. A peaceful day does not fully feel peaceful, because part of them is already wondering what might change next. Even silence can become heavy when you no longer know whether it means rest, distance, anger, or another problem waiting to surface. That is what makes this kind of suffering easy to hide. It builds quietly through repetition, until ordinary moments begin carrying more weight than they should. One confusing conversation may be easy to dismiss, but when another comes after it, the mind begins connecting things that once looked unrelated. Now they are not only reacting to what happened today, they are carrying yesterday into today, because the pattern has taught them not to relax too quickly. That may be when they begin understanding why you changed. They may remember how often you asked for clarity and realize you were not trying to keep conflict alive. You were trying to understand why reassurance kept being followed by another reason to doubt it. They may remember how cautious you became near the end and see that caution differently now. Because repeated uncertainty can train a person to listen more carefully and trust more slowly. What they once called insecurity starts looking more like a response to instability. What they once called weakness starts looking more like exhaustion. And what they once dismissed as your inability to move on can feel different when their own mind keeps returning to something that still does not feel resolved. The circumstances do not have to repeat exactly for that recognition to happen. Life does not need to recreate your story scene for scene. It only has to bring them close enough to distrust, emotional tension, or unanswered questions. For the pain they once judged from a distance to become something they finally understand from the inside. That is when old memories can begin changing meaning. A sentence you once said in frustration may suddenly sound reasonable. A night when you could not sleep may no longer look dramatic. The way you became quieter near the end may make more sense when they discover how tiring it is to keep explaining pain and still feel as though the real issue never gets touched. And God can allow truth to work that way. He does not need to make a spectacle out of their life. He can allow experience to bring the lesson close enough that the old excuses no longer work as easily. The exhaustion they once blamed on you now has context. The anxiety they may have treated like weakness looks different when they understand how uncertainty can keep a mind working long after the body wants to rest. That is why their suffering matters here. Not because you need to enjoy seeing them hurt, not because their pain is entertainment. God already knew what you were carrying when they were still dismissing it. What changes now is their ability to keep pretending that carrying that kind of weight was easy. The person who once wondered why you could not sleep may finally understand what keeps someone awake. The person who thought you were too sensitive may begin to understand what repeated instability does to a person's peace. The person who believed you should simply move on may discover that emotional pain does not disappear on someone else's schedule. The pain they once called weakness feels very different when they are the one carrying something close enough to understand its weight. And once that happens, suffering is no longer only hurting them, it is beginning to teach them. Because some of the very things they are now frustrated by may sound painfully familiar. They may become complaining about behaviors they once expected you to tolerate, without question. And when that connection starts becoming clear, the pain stops being only something they feel. It becomes a mirror. Part 2. The measure comes back. They may start hearing their own complaints differently now. A sentence comes out in frustration, something like, "I never know where I stand with this person." And for a moment, it may sound painfully close to something you once tried to tell them. That is where the suffering begins turning into a mirror. For a long time, certain behaviors were easy to justify when they were the one using them. Silence could be called needing space. Distance could be called protecting themselves. A conversation that left you confused could be explained as nothing more than you misunderstanding what was said. As long as they were the one deciding when closeness began and when it disappeared, they could tell themselves the problem was your reaction. But the same behavior feels different when they are no longer controlling which side of it they stand on. If someone goes cold without explanation, the silence no longer looks harmless. If a conversation keeps getting turned around until they are defending something they never meant, confusion no longer looks like weakness. If affection appears and disappears depending on whether they are behaving the way another person wants, emotional distance begins to feel less like space and more like control. And once they feel that difference, their own complaints can start revealing more than they intended. They may say, "They keep twisting my words," and suddenly remember how often you walked away from conversations, trying to understand how what you said had been turned into something else. They may complain that somebody is making them feel small, only to remember the times your feelings were minimized or treated as proof that you were too sensitive. They may say they feel used or ignored, and each complaint brings them closer to the same uncomfortable question. What did this feel like when I was the one doing it? That question removes some of the distance pride depends on. It is easy to defend a behavior when you only know what it feels like to use it. The moral weight changes when you experience what that behavior does from the receiving side. This is where Matthew 7:2 fits the moment. Jesus said, "With the measure you use, it will be measured to you." The point is not that every hurt must return in an identical form. It is that the standard we apply to other people can look very different when we are the one standing underneath it. If dishonesty seemed acceptable when it protected them from accountability, dishonesty feels different when it leaves them wondering what is true. If emotional withdrawal felt harmless when it gave them control, withdrawal feels different when somebody else creates the distance and they are the one waiting for reassurance. If blame once helped them avoid discomfort, blame becomes harder to tolerate when every problem suddenly lands at their feet. The behavior has not changed. Their position inside it has, and that shift can expose what explanations kept hidden. For years, they may have had reasons for everything. They were stressed. They needed space. You misunderstood. You pushed too hard. Or you were asking too much. Those explanations may have protected them when you were the one hurting. But experience tests whether an excuse still sounds reasonable once the same pressure enters their own life. That is where the complaint begins becoming a confession. Not because they necessarily admit everything at once, but because the words they use to describe their own pain begin sounding too familiar to ignore. I feel like I have to watch every word. I feel like I am always the one being blamed. When statements like that echo the reality you once tried to explain, it becomes harder to keep believing your reactions came from nowhere. And the more unfair their own situation feels, the harder it can become to forget how easily they dismissed similar pain when it belonged to you. God can use that kind of recognition. He does not have to force repentance to make truth visible. Sometimes, he allows experience to become the mirror pride kept turning away from. They may still resist what they see, or blame somebody else. But the old certainty begins weakening, because now the pain has context. They know what it feels like to leave a conversation confused, to face unpredictable affection, or to live with words and behavior pulling in different directions. Once they know that from the inside, what happened to you becomes harder to reduce to a personality flaw. Your confusion was not suddenly wrong, because they now recognize it. Your exhaustion mattered before they ever felt anything similar. And your need for honesty mattered before their own life taught them why dishonesty is so difficult to live around. Their experience does not create the truth of what you survived. It simply makes that truth harder for them to dismiss. And once the measure begins looking different from the other side, another problem starts developing. The story they built around themselves depends on those old explanations continuing to work. If the behavior now feels cruel when it is directed at them, keeping the image of themselves as the person who never caused that kind of pain becomes much harder. That is where the next pressure begins. Not with one dramatic exposure, but with the growing difficulty of holding the old image together while reality keeps giving them something else to see. Part 3. Keeping the image together gets harder. They may start noticing that people are not responding to them the way they used to. A person who once accepted every explanation now pauses before agreeing. Another quietly pulls back. Somebody who used to defend them no longer seems as certain as before. Nothing dramatic has to happen for that shift to matter. For a long time, controlling the image may have felt easy. A confident answer could end an uncomfortable conversation. Charm could soften a contradiction. Blame could redirect attention before anyone looked too closely. But an image becomes harder to maintain once different people begin having their own experiences. One person remembers a detail that does not fit the story. Another notices that the same kind of conflict keeps appearing around them. Someone else starts trusting what they are seeing instead of waiting to be told how to interpret it. And little by little, the old ease begins to disappear. They can still smile, explain, and present the version of themselves they want the room to believe. But presentation works best when reality is cooperating with it. Once the pattern becomes familiar, every new contradiction creates more work. A story that once needed one explanation may now need another explanation to protect it. And that new explanation has to remain consistent with everything that was said before. That is where control begins turning into maintenance. They may find themselves paying closer attention to who still believes them, who has become distant, and which conversation left someone less convinced than they were before. A simple question can feel more threatening when they are no longer certain that the usual answer will settle it. Someone asking for space may feel like rejection. A reasonable boundary may feel like disloyalty, because independent reactions are harder to manage when control has become part of how someone feels secure. This is one reason image can become exhausting. It depends on other people continuing to react in predictable ways. When those reactions change, more emotional energy goes into reading the room, adjusting the story, and trying to understand why something that once worked easily is no longer producing the same result. You may remember how invisible that made you feel when you were the one trying to explain what was happening. People often saw isolated moments while you were living inside repetition. They heard one reasonable explanation and did not know what came before it. They saw charm in public and had no idea how different the same person could feel behind closed doors. But a convincing image never made your experience false. It only meant the people around you had not seen enough of the pattern yet. Time can change that without anyone making a public announcement. Repeated behavior gives people more than one moment to judge, and someone who once rushed to take their side may become slower to do it when the same kind of conflict keeps returning. Nobody has to accuse them of anything. The room can change quietly, and that quiet change can be especially difficult for someone who depends on controlling how every situation is understood. God does not have to tear an image apart in front of a crowd for truth to begin showing through it. Sometimes, He simply allows enough time for people to notice patterns for themselves, to trust their own experience, and to see contradictions that the old explanation no longer settles. When that happens, the person who once controlled the story can begin feeling less certain about how much of the story they still control. That uncertainty creates pressure, not because everyone suddenly knows everything, but because they no longer know who has started seeing enough to question the version they were given. What once felt effortless begins requiring attention. What once felt like power starts feeling more like vigilance. That is not peace, it is management. And management becomes harder when the image is being asked to cover patterns that keep repeating. Eventually, the difference between image and character becomes difficult to ignore. Character can survive questions because it does not depend on every room seeing the same performance. An image is more fragile because it depends on perception staying under control. When that control weakens, the person maintaining it may begin feeling exposed even when nobody has openly confronted them. And while they are trying to hold everything together, another realization starts forming underneath the pressure. They begin comparing the life they are managing now with the steadiness they once treated as ordinary, the calm they barely noticed, the consistency they expected without appreciating, and the person who kept trying to repair tension instead of feeding it can all begin to look different in hindsight. Because sometimes you do not recognize the value of peace while you are standing inside it. You recognize it after you have spent enough time trying to manufacture something that only looked like peace from the outside. Part 4. They remember what real was. There were things you did for them so consistently that they barely noticed them while they were happening. You were the one who tried to calm the room after an argument, who checked in when something felt wrong, who prayed when there were no easy answers, and who kept looking for a way to repair what had been damaged instead of immediately walking away. At the time, those things may not have looked remarkable to them. Consistency rarely does, when someone assumes it will always be there. Peace can become almost invisible when another person is quietly doing the work required to protect it. But once that steadiness is gone, our ordinary moments begin feeling different. A conversation becomes tense, and there is nobody trying to soften it. A disagreement lasts longer because neither person wants to be the first to repair it. Silence no longer feels restful because nobody knows whether it means space, anger, punishment, or another problem waiting to happen. Those are the moments when memory can become unexpectedly powerful. They may not sit down one day and suddenly admit that you were right about everything. Recognition usually does not happen that neatly. It can begin with something much smaller. They hear a certain tone in a conversation and remember how carefully you used to choose your words. They come home emotionally exhausted and remember that there was once someone who tried to make home feel calmer instead of turning every tension into another fight. They find themselves wishing for one honest conversation and remember how many times you asked for exactly that. The things that once felt ordinary begin standing out because contrast has given them a different meaning. That is one of the strange things about peace. People often recognize its value only after they have lived long enough without it. When peace is present, it can look boring, compared with excitement, attention, or the thrill of something new. But excitement and peace are not the same thing. Excitement can make a moment feel alive. Peace is what makes a life feel safe enough to rest inside. And if someone spent years mistaking intensity for love, they may not understand that difference until the intensity starts costing them more than it gives. This is where memories of you can change. They are no longer only remembering what you said or where you went together. They begin remembering how certain things felt around you. The patience you offered when a conversation became difficult. The way you tried to understand before assuming the worst. The prayers you whispered when you did not know how to fix what was happening. The fact that you kept returning to honesty, even when honesty made the conversation uncomfortable. None of that means you were perfect. You were human. You became frustrated. You probably said things you wished you had said differently. And there may have been moments when exhaustion changed the way you responded. But there is a difference between being imperfect inside a relationship and being committed to destroying the trust that relationship needs in order to survive. Over time, that difference becomes easier to see, especially when someone has spent enough time around relationships where every disagreement becomes a contest and every weakness becomes something that can be used later. That is when gentleness stops looking weak. It starts looking rare. Consistency stops looking predictable. It starts looking valuable. And the person who kept trying to bring peace back into the relationship no longer looks like someone who simply refused to leave. They begin to look like someone who was carrying far more of the emotional weight than anyone wanted to admit. That realization can be uncomfortable because it changes the story. It is easier to remember you as difficult if they never think about how often you were reacting to instability. It is easier to call you needy if they forget how many times reassurance was followed by another reason not to trust. It is easier to say you wanted too much if they never count how often what you were asking for was something basic: honesty, consistency, respect, and a conversation that did not leave you more confused than when it began. But contrast has a way of bringing those details back, not all at once, one memory at a time. And sometimes, the memory that hurts most is not a dramatic one. It is something ordinary. You sitting beside them while they talked through something nobody else knew. You remembering a detail that mattered to them. You trying to make peace after a difficult day. you praying for someone who was making it increasingly difficult for you to stay. Those moments may not have impressed them then, because they were accustomed to receiving them. Now they can begin to understand what those moments were actually worth. Some things look ordinary while you have them, because you never notice how much another person is doing to keep them peaceful. And this is where I want you to be careful. Their recognition is not supposed to become the new measure of your worth. You were not valuable because they eventually missed what you brought. Your patience had value when they ignored it. Your sincerity mattered when they doubted it. The peace you tried to create was real, even while they were busy disturbing it. God did not need their regret to recognize what was in your heart. He saw the nights when you prayed instead of retaliating. He saw the times you tried to repair something you did not break alone. He saw the difference between a heart trying to preserve peace and a pattern that kept making peace harder to keep. And now the contrast may be making that difference harder for them to overlook. What once seemed ordinary can begin looking far more precious after life becomes louder, less certain, and harder to settle inside. But recognizing what was valuable creates another kind of weight. Because once you understand what something meant, you also have to face what your own choices did to it. You can remember the peace, you can miss the consistency, you can finally recognize the sincerity, but recognition does not place you back at the moment before the betrayal. And that is where the next consequence begins. Because feeling the loss is one thing. Realizing you cannot go back and make the original choice differently is something else. Part 5. Feeling the loss doesn't undo the choice. There are decisions you can regret later, but you can never go back and make them for the first time again. That is where this becomes heavier for them. Because remembering what was real is one thing. Realizing they had a moment when they could have protected it and chose differently is another. At first, loss can still be explained away. They can tell themselves the relationship was already broken. They can say too much had happened. They can decide leaving was inevitable or that betrayal was simply the result of circumstances neither of you could control. Those explanations may work for a while, especially when everything is still new and there are enough distractions to keep the past from becoming quiet. But clarity often changes the story. Once they begin recognizing the peace they disturbed, the consistency they took for granted, and the trust they damaged, the original choice can start looking different from the way they needed it to look when they made it. What once felt justified may now look reckless. What once felt like freedom may now look like avoidance. And what once seemed easy to replace may become something they finally understand was built slowly through trust, patience, and years of shared history. That is when regret becomes more complicated. It is no longer only, I miss what I had. It can become, I had a chance to treat it differently. That thought carries a different kind of weight because it points back to agency. They were not standing outside the moment. They participated in it. They made choices inside it. Maybe there were conversations when honesty could have changed the direction. Maybe there were moments when accountability could have prevented another wound. Maybe there were chances to stop blaming, stop hiding, or stop using distance as a way to avoid what needed to be faced. And when enough time has passed, those moments can become harder to remember casually. Not because every mistake can be reduced to one dramatic decision. Relationships are rarely that simple. But there are still moments when a person knows they are choosing between protecting trust and protecting themselves from discomfort. Betrayal often happens somewhere inside that choice. For someone who has spent a long time explaining everything through what other people did wrong, that realization can be especially difficult because blame can reduce pain temporarily. It can protect pride. It can keep someone from asking questions they do not want to answer. But blame cannot move the clock backward. Even if they now understand why you became exhausted, that understanding does not remove the nights you already lived through. Even if they finally see why trust became difficult, they cannot return to the first moment that trust was broken and choose honesty instead. Even if they recognize what they lost, recognition cannot make the loss unhappen. Feeling the cost of a choice does not rewind the moment the choice was made. And that may be one of the hardest things for them to sit with, because consequences are easier to resist when you can still believe they were entirely caused by somebody else. The weight changes when you begin seeing your own fingerprints on the outcome. That does not mean they suddenly accept responsibility for everything. They may still defend themselves. They may still rewrite parts of the story. They may move between regret and blame, depending on what feels easier in the moment. But once enough, truth has entered the picture. Returning completely to the old explanation becomes harder. There is now something they know that they did not want to know before. The person they blamed was not the whole problem. The peace they lost was not meaningless. The trust they damaged did not disappear without a cause, and the choice they once treated like a door to freedom may have closed something behind them that they did not fully appreciate until much later. This is not about saying they can never change. People can repent. People can become honest. People can make better choices after terrible ones. But growth does not require pretending the past never happened. Real change begins by facing it. That is part of what makes this stage different from simply missing you. Missing someone can still be about loneliness. Regret can still be about discomfort. But confronting the choice means looking at what happened without immediately reaching for an escape route. It means admitting that there were consequences attached to decisions that once felt convenient. God can bring a person to that kind of confrontation without taking away their freedom. He can allow enough distance for excuses to lose some of their strength. He can let contrast reveal what was once ignored. He can bring memories back into focus after emotion and pride have stopped controlling the whole picture. And then the person still has to decide what they will do with what they now see. That part belongs to them. You do not have to manage it for them. You do not have to make them understand more deeply. You do not have to return to the old wound simply because they may finally be standing close enough to recognize it. Their clarity does not require your presence, and their regret does not create an obligation for you to step back into the moment they damaged. What matters here is the consequence inside the realization itself. They can wish the conversation had gone differently. They can wish they had listened sooner. They can wish they had protected what they later learned to value. But wishing happens now. The choice happened then. And sometimes, the most painful distance in a person's life is the distance between those two moments. That is where the weight begins changing shape. It is no longer only about what happened around them. It is becoming about what happened inside them, what they avoided, what they justified, what they kept repeating, and what those patterns have now produced. Because when a choice cannot be undone, the question eventually stops being only, what did I lose? A harder question begins to surface. What in me kept choosing the things that created this loss? And once that question appears, the consequence has nowhere left to stay, purely outside of them. It begins turning inward. They may begin noticing that the hardest pressure no longer comes only from what happens around them. It follows them home. The argument ends, but the tension stays. A relationship changes, yet the same distrust appears again. A new environment may feel lighter for a while. Then the same need to control, defend, and manage perception begins returning. For a long time, they may have believed the problem always existed, somewhere outside themselves. It was your reaction, your questions, or your refusal to accept their version. Later, it became somebody else's attitude, distance, or unwillingness to keep overlooking the same behavior. Blame gave them a place to put every uncomfortable consequence. As long as somebody else carried the fault, they could keep expecting peace from the next change. A different partner might fix it. A different circle might feel easier. A different story might finally make everything settle. But when the room changes and the same tension returns, that explanation starts losing strength. The room changed. The pattern didn't. That is where the suffering becomes harder to keep outside themselves. A person can leave one relationship without leaving the habits that damaged it. They can start over while avoiding responsibility and treating disagreement like a threat. At first, novelty can hide that. New people have not seen enough history to recognize the pattern. There is space for charm, confidence, and a carefully managed version of events. But closeness eventually asks for more than presentation. It asks for honesty. It asks for consistency. It asks whether someone can hear uncomfortable truth without turning every disagreement into a fight. If those things never change, the same pressure starts building again. This is where behaviors that once created quick control can begin creating long-term instability. Control may end an argument, but it can damage trust. A lie may escape one difficult moment, yet make later conversations harder to navigate. Blame may protect pride today, while preventing the reflection that could change tomorrow. Those choices rarely destroy everything at once. They accumulate. Trust becomes thinner. Conversations become more guarded. Closeness starts carrying tension that should not be there. Another relationship begins feeling strangely familiar. That is the deeper reversal. The things they kept pushing outward begin shaping the life they must live inside. If trust is treated as disposable, trusting relationships become harder to build. If closeness becomes mainly about control, closeness can start feeling unsafe for everyone involved. If accountability always feels like attack, growth becomes difficult. Nothing around them has to collapse dramatically for those consequences to matter. The emotional cost can build quietly. That is why their suffering now is bigger than one person hurting them back. It is bigger than a few sleepless nights or one painful argument. Those moments may get their attention. The deeper problem is what happens when the pattern survives every change around them. It follows, and when that happens often enough, the question begins changing. At first, they may ask, "Why does this keep happening to me?" Later, a harder question can appear. "Why does this keep happening around me?" That question is much harder to answer with blame alone. The common thread is becoming difficult to ignore. That recognition can become impossible to keep avoiding. This is one way God can bring truth close without taking away their choice. He can allow a pattern enough time to reveal what it produces. He can let repeated choices create enough evidence that the connection becomes clearer. He can expose the difference between changing circumstances and changing character. God does not need to manufacture every painful detail. Sometimes the choices already carry enough weight. Refusing to repair trust has consequences. Constant dishonesty has consequences. Treating correction like an attack has consequences. Living through image and control also has consequences. Eventually, Those habits shape the emotional life a person must wake up inside. They may have believed freedom meant escaping the person who kept asking difficult questions. Now, some of those questions can begin coming from life itself. Why is peace still difficult? Why does trust keep breaking? Why does every new beginning eventually begin feeling familiar? The answer may not arrive through one dramatic moment. Sometimes repetition becomes the answer. At first, suffering was simply happening to them. Then it started reminding them of what happened to you. Now it can reveal what their own patterns have been building all along. That is why everything begins turning inward. The betrayal did not create peace simply because they walked away first. Hurting someone did not make them stronger simply because they looked unaffected afterward. Controlling the story did not create the character needed to sustain a peaceful life. Eventually, people have to live inside what repeated choices have been shaping within them. That does not mean change is impossible. It means change requires facing what pretending could never repair. And this is where the story begins shifting toward you. For so long, you carried confusion they refused to face. You carried questions they would not answer. You carried emotional weight created by choices you did not make. Now, more of that weight is returning to the place where responsibility actually belongs. But this story does not end with the burden simply moving from you to them. God is also doing something with what you carried. While they are being brought closer to their own patterns, you are being led somewhere different. You are learning that their choices do not deserve permanent residence inside your mind, body, or future. That is the deeper reversal waiting on the other side. They are beginning to face what followed them. You are beginning to release what never belonged on your shoulders forever. You may notice the change on an ordinary morning before you even know what to call it. You wake up, and they are not the first thing on your mind. The room is quiet. This time, the quiet feels safe. You reach for your phone without that old rush of tension in your chest. Nothing dramatic has happened, but your body is no longer preparing for a problem that is not there. For a long time, you carried the relationship far beyond the moments when they were physically present. You carried it into sleep, prayer, work, and conversations that had nothing to do with them. An argument could end at night while continuing inside your mind until morning. A confusing message could occupy hours of your attention. Even peaceful moments felt temporary because part of you remained ready for the next shift. That is what prolonged emotional weight can do. It follows you, and for a long time, they seemed free while you carried what their choices left behind. They moved forward. You carried the aftermath, but now the reversal is becoming clearer. They may be getting close enough to understand the weight they once dismissed. At the same time, God is teaching you that the weight does not have to remain yours. That is a different kind of justice. It does not require you to enjoy their pain. It means the burden no longer has to stay where betrayal placed it. You may notice that freedom through small changes. You stop checking whether they posted something. Their name does not hit your body the way it once did. You remember a conversation without spending another hour rewriting what you wish you had said. A memory comes back, but it does not pull your whole day into the past. Something is loosening. You still know what happened. You simply are not living inside it every hour anymore. That is not forgetting. It means the past can remain true without controlling your present. God often restores people through changes that look almost ordinary from the outside. The body stops preparing for battles that are no longer coming. The mind stops trying to solve questions that never received honest answers. You begin trusting what you saw instead of constantly arguing with your own memory. Little by little, your attention returns to your own life. You can sit in a peaceful room without searching for the hidden problem. A good moment can simply be good. People may notice that change before you do. They may say you seem calmer, more rested, or more like yourself again. That does not mean life suddenly became perfect. It means less of your energy is being spent surviving emotional confusion. There is a different look on someone who is no longer constantly bracing for conflict. Their face softens. Their body begins learning that peace does not always hide a threat. That is restoration too. Peace starts feeling possible again, not borrowed. And this is where Psalm 55:22 becomes deeply personal. Cast your burden on the Lord, and He will sustain you. The verse does not ask you to deny what happened. It tells you where the weight can go. You can bring God the questions that never received answers. You can bring Him the anger that still rises unexpectedly. You can even bring the part of you that still wants them to understand. Casting the burden does not make the story false. It means the story no longer sits on your shoulders every waking hour. Some people leave a painful relationship physically while carrying it emotionally for years. The person is gone, but the argument keeps running in their mind. The betrayal happened earlier, yet every new day still bends around what happened. God can begin breaking that pattern. He does not have to erase the memory. He can change what the memory is allowed to demand from you. You can remember without returning. You can understand without obsessing. You can forgive without pretending trust was never broken. You can leave judgment with God without watching every consequence unfold. That is where the title reaches its deeper payoff. They may finally understand why you were exhausted. They may discover how hard confusion is to live inside. They may feel enough instability to recognize why your peace slowly disappeared. But God is doing something different with you now. He is not asking you to supervise their lesson. He is teaching you to release the burden that once made their apparent freedom feel so unfair. For a long time, you carried the pain while they looked free. Now, they may carry enough consequence to understand what that pain felt like. But your freedom does not come from watching them suffer. It comes when what they did no longer owns your inner life. That is the reversal. You no longer need their condition to prove that God saw you. He saw you before anything turned around. He saw the nights when sleep would not come. He heard the prayers you struggled to finish. He knew how tired your heart had become before anyone else understood the reason. And now, He can sustain the part of you that thought you had to carry everything alone. Healing does not mean every hard day disappears. Some mornings may still feel heavier than others. But pain no longer has the same authority. It can visit without taking over. It can remind you without defining you. You are learning where to place the weight when it returns. That changes everything. You do not need bitterness while they face what their choices produced. You do not need to celebrate their confusion. You also do not need to rescue them from every consequence. Their lesson belongs between them and God. Your healing belongs between you and God. They may finally understand the weight you carried, but God is teaching you that you do not have to carry it forever. And once that becomes real, you no longer need to keep looking backward for proof. Justice is not measured only by how badly they are doing. It is also visible in what no longer controls you. The betrayal no longer gets every morning. It no longer gets every quiet room. It no longer gets the future God is helping you rebuild. They may finally be carrying enough weight to understand your pain, but you are learning to put that weight down. And that is the greater reversal. For a long time, part of you may have wanted them to understand what they did to you. Not because you wanted destruction, and not because their suffering could return the nights you lost. You wanted them to understand, because being wounded and then dismissed creates a second kind of pain. You wanted them to know the confusion was real, the exhaustion was real. The way your heart became cautious was real. And maybe you believed their understanding would finally prove that you were not imagining what happened. They may understand more now than they once did. Life may have brought them close enough to uncertainty that your old questions no longer seem unreasonable. They may know how difficult peace becomes when trust feels unstable. They may understand why your mind kept returning to conversations long after those conversations had ended. But something more important is happening now. You do not need to be there to watch it. For a while, you may have searched for signs that they were finally facing what they caused. You may have wondered whether they were happy or whether the image was hiding more. You may have imagined the day when they finally admitted what you had been trying to explain. But healing eventually asks you to stop making their awareness the proof that your pain mattered. God saw it before they understood it. He saw what happened when nobody else had the whole story. He saw the moments when you questioned yourself because their version sounded more confident than your memory. He saw what betrayal did to your ability to rest, trust, and feel safe. And he did not need their confession before your pain became worthy of his attention. That means you can stop waiting for their life to give you permission to believe your own experience. If consequences are confronting them now, that lesson belongs to them. You do not have to supervise it. You do not have to check whether it is happening quickly enough. You do not need social media, secondhand reports, or visible collapse to confirm that truth still matters. Justice was never supposed to become another way for them to occupy your mind. There comes a point when looking backward for proof begins costing the peace you prayed to recover. And God did not bring you this far to keep you standing beside someone else's consequences. Your peace is still worth protecting. There are mornings ahead that do not have to begin with their name. There are conversations that will not require you to defend your reality. There are quiet rooms where silence can feel safe again. Peace does not mean the betrayal was acceptable. It means the betrayal no longer controls everything that comes after it. That is why the greatest reversal is not simply that they may finally understand your sleepless nights. It is not even that they may recognize why your heart became tired. Those things matter, but they are not the end of the story. The deeper reversal is happening in opposite directions. They are being brought closer to the weight they once dismissed. You are being led farther from the place where that weight controlled your life. They may finally understand. You no longer have to wait for them to. And if part of you still wonders whether God noticed the days when you felt invisible, remember this. He saw your pain before they had language for it. He knew the truth before anyone admitted it. He was already holding you when you thought you were carrying everything alone. Their understanding may arrive late. God's presence did not. So leave their lesson with them. Leave judgment with God. Do not pick the burden back up because you hear they are carrying something now. Your healing does not require front-row seats to their consequences. It requires room for peace to become normal again. If this is where your heart is today, write "God saw my pain" in the comments. Subscribe for more messages about healing, truth, boundaries, and God's presence after narcissistic betrayal. They once watched your pain from a distance. Now they may finally understand what it felt like. But the greatest reversal was never that they finally felt your pain. It was that God did not leave you inside it.